I think everything that we've been going through in the last 18, 19 months now has parallels with the situation 300 years ago. I'm not going to list these out as we go through, but you may spot some things that remind you of the last year and a half, and then at the end of the talk I'll gather some of the points I think of parallels together. So this talk has a plan that looks like this. So I'd like first to introduce the idea of smallpox and also cowpox too, because these are key concepts for understanding the 130 odd years that I'm going to talk about. It's a bit heavy on information, but actually I think you'll find that is useful as we get into the subject more deeply. Then I'm going to discuss how inoculation reached Britain 300 years ago this year. I'm going to talk to you about how they tested it for safety and effectiveness. And you might like to decide whether their experiments and tests were good ones or not. Then we'll look at the wider spread of inoculation in the 18th century. We couldn't be here in Hertford without mentioning Thomas Dimsdale and his famous patients who he inoculated. Then we'll move on to Edward Jenner and vaccination, a word that we've all got very familiar with this year. And lastly, we'll look at compulsory vaccination and anti-vaxxers who sadly are also with us now. And then some parallels between the past and present. So that's what I'm going to do. I hope none of this is too horrifying if you just had supper, but this is smallpox. This hand, it's much worse if you see it on somebody's face. The disease itself dates back thousands of years, but it was only in 1721, for the first time in this country, there was a way of preventing it from infecting people. All right, this is a bit disgusting, but I apologize. The process, and you can see in all of these different pustules on the hand, there's fluid. The process involved collecting some of that fluid from an infected person's pustules, making a cut in the healthy subject's skin, and then putting the pus into the skin, and that would give them a mild, well, you hope it's mild, dose of smallpox, and that creates antibodies against getting smallpox again. Back in 300 years ago, in fact, all through the time period I'm talking about, they had no understanding about how this worked. This is before the whole idea of germs had even been discovered. That wasn't happened for another 140 years after 1721. No concepts about immunity, antibodies, anything like that. But they found that this actually worked, or at least worked better than the not doing it. So here are some key terms. So the process I've just described, taking live smallpox pus and effectively introducing it into the body of a healthy person was called variously inoculation, variolation, and engrafting, and it was using mild smallpox. We're also going to look at vaccination, from vacca, the Latin for cow, which was a word invented by Edward Jenner. And that was to introduce live cowpox pus to cause a mild, non-lethal infection, but miraculously produced antibodies to give future protection against smallpox. And that's, in a nutshell, how smallpox is no longer present in the world because of this particular process. So I'd like to talk a bit more about cowpox. So just you have a bit more clue about what it's like. So here is a nice picture of a woman milking a cow, but on occasion, the cow's udders, this is a drawing of an udder, could look like this, and the spots on it are cowpox pustules. It's a disease of cattle, and as you can understand, if the milkmaid were milking this cow, if she'd got any cuts on her hands, she would be likely to get the pus from the cowpox pustules into her hands. Then she probably would contract cowpox herself. This is the hand of a particular milkmaid called Sarah Nelms, who we will find more about later on, and she's very important in this story. And when milkmaids got cowpox, they came out in spots like this. Okay, so we've got two different methods of curbing smallpox during the period that we're talking about. How successful were they? If you caught smallpox naturally, just by living, it had a death rate of between 1 in 7, 1 in 8 people who caught it. And during an epidemic or a pandemic, it could cause the deaths of half the people who caught it, or sometimes more. If you caught it and survived it, you were very, very likely to be disfigured, and it was a major cause of blindness in the 18th century. So if you had the process that I've just described with the hand, you had variolation with live smallpox. When they first started doing that, they found they had a death rate of about 1 in 50 people who were inoculated, had variolated. That was decidedly better odds than living with the possibility of catching smallpox. So it certainly helped. If you were in the 19th century and vaccinated, if carried out with clean instruments, you should have had a 100% survival rate if you were a healthy subject. Now, I've said already, they don't have any concept of germs. So actually your chances of having clean instruments are somewhat less than perfect, but it should protect you against smallpox. Next, I've got some key dates. Now, you don't need to know particular dates. It's much more the sequence that matters. So for the first 75 years of attempting to curb smallpox in this country, live smallpox pus is used. So it's inoculation, variolation. Then you have a period of around 40 years where they're both inoculating and vaccinating people. And they begin to find that the people who are vaccinated do much better than the people who are variolated and run that 2% risk of dying. So finally, variolation is banned and vaccination becomes the way forward, with increasing frequency and then compulsion that it's only vaccination used. So let's go back to the beginning and find out how inoculation comes to this country in 1721. In general, the curbing of smallpox tends to be told as a British upper-class male success story. Interestingly, it wasn't like that at all at the beginning. It wasn't actually British. They were inoculating people in China, in West Africa, in Turkey, in various countries of the world, but not here or anywhere in Europe. And it wasn't actually a man who brought it to this country. It was a woman called Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. And she is responsible, with some help, of getting it to Britain. So here she is. This portrait is painted in Turkey. She had been famed for her beauty, married, and then caught smallpox. She survived, but she had terrible scarring from it, and her brother had died of it. She was in Turkey as the wife of the British ambassador there. And she absolutely loved Turkey. She loved the culture, she loved the people. And she was very interested to find that the Turks were having their children inoculated against smallpox. She called it engrafting. And she wanted that protection for her own children. Here she is with her little boy, Edward, and she had a daughter while she was in Turkey as well. So she enlisted the help of a man called Charles Maitland, who was the Scottish surgeon who was the embassy's medical advisor. I can't find a portrait of him. I don't think he was ever painted, but here is his tombstone from Aberdeenshire. So Lady Mary found an elderly Greek woman who did inoculations. And when her husband was away, Maitland sourced some smallpox pus for her, and he watched the operation very closely. So this is the little boy who was inoculated, young Edward. Maitland was fairly appalled because the Greek woman had a very shaky hand. She had a rusty needle to do it with, and he actually took Edward's other arm and mimicked what she was doing. So he did his first inoculation on the child at the same time. Young Edward came out in spots, but had recovered fine by the time his father got back, which was a good thing. And back in England, Lady Mary had her daughter engrafted by Maitland as well. She did this in 1721 because there was a major outbreak of smallpox in that year, actually both here and in New England as well.
Participants, that's good. Yeah.
The little girl recovered fine, and some very important physicians came to see her. So the whole idea of inoculating against smallpox spread.
Hilary and Tom.
I'm sorry to stop. Please, would the person who's talking not talk? It's really hard speaking against you. Thank you. And the inoculation done on the little boy and then the little girl reached the ears of the royal family. They were very interested in the whole process of inoculation, but they were, maybe understandably, a bit hesitant and wanted reassurance. This is Caroline, Princess of Wales. She's later the Queen to George II. They had a growing family, but their oldest daughter had caught smallpox just in the course of time and nearly died of it. So her mother was really keen to protect all her other children from getting it. But was it really safe? Did it work? They wanted experiments to find out whether this was true. This is Newgate. Newgate was a prison, and it was literally a gate of the City of London. And the King, George I, offered pardons to 6 prisoners in Newgate in return for Maitland trying out inoculation on them and see what happened. Maitland inoculated them. They were fine, they recovered, and they were duly pardoned for their crimes. Princess Caroline also wanted to check it out on children, and she had some orphans in London inoculators as well, and they all recovered fine. So Maitland wrote up his account of the prisoners' inoculation and dedicated it to the Prince and Princess of Wales. And this is the page of it that gives the list of the different prisoners and their ages, and then a detailed account of how they took to the inoculation and recovered. And they decided that it was safe, but was it effective? And so they had to set up another experiment in a place that you will all recognise, I hope, Christ Hospital in Hertford. Maitland decided, he was getting on a bit by this time, he decided that he would retire into the country, and he came to Hertford to move his practice here. One of the 6 prisoners from Newgate, Elizabeth Harrison, who was 19 years old, was sent to Christ Hospital to nurse the smallpox sufferers there. She even had to share a bed with one of the boys at Christ Hospital who had come out with an attack of smallpox. And she stayed at Christ Hospital doing this kind of nursing for 10 weeks. And she didn't catch smallpox from any of her patients. So actually the inoculation was deemed to have been successful. So this is a list of all the people Charles Maitland inoculated through 1721. It starts with Lady Mary's daughter, also called Mary, and you can see a group of people bracketed together. They are the Newgate prisoners. A little bit further down, just under halfway down, there's a young girl called Mary Batt, and I just want to take this one inoculation that Maitland did in the Hertford area, and make the point that even he, though he'd been inoculating people, didn't really understand anything about how the process worked. And he could be very surprised by unintended consequences, just because it's Hertford, just to show you where it all is. Or some of this has got covered up, never mind. Bottom left-hand corner is the edge of Hertford, and the hospital that's mentioned down there is Christ Hospital. Up at the top, but I'm sadly covered, I think, by some of the things on the screen, is a place called Temple, which is near Tunnel. And that's where Anne Batt lived with her parents, who were Quakers. They were very wealthy. They had a big house and estate there. And she had servants to look after her after she'd been inoculated. So Maitland inoculates her. The servants look after her. And suddenly there are 6 servants with smallpox. And one of them actually dies of it. And Maitland is horrified. He's discovered that the inoculation brings about an attack of smallpox, which can actually infect other people. And it was a very hard way to learn that you needed, after inoculation, to have a period of quarantine for the patient. Otherwise, they would give other people smallpox. One of the consequences of this was, of course, that inoculation could only be for wealthy people, partly because you have to pay for the inoculation in the first place, pay the surgeon, but also because even if you inoculated people for free, poor people would go back and take the disease back to the work, to their families. And so it only had a limited social spread in the 18th century. Here are the poshest people who Maitland inoculated. So this is the oldest children of the Prince and Princess of Wales at Kew, you might recognise. And Maitland assisted in inoculating the 2 young women in coloured dresses, and also inoculated the young son of the Prince and Princess of Wales, who was second in line to the throne. He hadn't actually got to this country yet. He was still in Hanover, and Charles Maitland was sent there to inoculate him, and was paid 1,000 guineas for that particular job. That's about £2.5 million in today's money. But it wasn't just him who was doing inoculations. Other inoculators set up in 18th century Britain. And there was a particular family called the Suttons. Robert Sutton came from Suffolk. He had 8 sons, 7 of whom became inoculators. And the most well-known was Daniel Sutton. Daniel Sutton decided to set up business in Ingatestone in Essex. And this is an advert from the Ipswich Journal. saying that he'd setting up as an inoculator. It was a sensible place to choose, actually, because it was on the road to Harwich and attracted travellers to and from the continent. And actually, Daniel Sutton made a lot of money from his inoculations. Here is his house in Egerton, and the pamphlet describing his work. When there were outbreaks of smallpox in particular places in the south of England, he would travel there and do mass inoculations of people. I'm sure not cleaning up anything in between different patients. He also received an invitation to go to Russia and inoculate Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia, but he turned that down. And then the Russians came to Dr. Thomas Dimsdale of Hertford and asked if he would go to Russia. So this is Thomas Dimsdale. He began to practice medicine in Hertford in 1734, and he built this building, which I think quite a lot of people watching this will know, the Pest House in Benjo. It was an isolation hospital set up in 1763, and this was where he would have done his inoculations and also kept his patients there till they were no longer infectious. This is his publication. It first published in 1767. It went through loads of different editions. This is the seventh edition, and was translated into lots of different languages. And here is Catherine the Great. In 1768, Dimsdale went to Russia to inoculate the Empress and her son. It's a tricky business, inoculating an empress, and he did apparently set up a horse, a very speedy horse, which would help him escape if anything went wrong. But it didn't go wrong. It was fine. And she made him a baron. This is the lancet encase. The lancet was the lancet he used to inoculate the Empress herself. Along with his baronetcy, he was paid £10,000 and given an annuity of 500 a year. So he made a great deal of money out of this. He also was given presents. So the box on the left contains a tea and coffee service in porcelain, with each piece monogrammed with TD for Thomas Dimsdale. And on the right is a snuff box in gold and silver and jewels given to Dimsdale's son, who had travelled with him. And in 1781, Thomas Dimsdale went back to Russia, invited to inoculate two of the Empress's grandsons. But he didn't just inoculate famous people abroad. This is a man called Oh My, painted by Joshua Reynolds. And Oh My was the first Tahitian to visit this country. He came with Captain Cook and Joseph Banks. Now, Oh My wasn't the first Tahitian to reach Europe, but the first man from Tahiti who came to Europe went to France and immediately caught smallpox and died. And King George III was determined that this wouldn't happen to Oh My, and he sent him to Thomas Dimsdale in Bengio to be inoculated, and Omai lived to go home again, back to Tahiti. And now we come to Edward Jenner and vaccination. Quite often, the story of curbing smallpox actually begins here with Jenner. But I think it's, and I hope you found that what happened in the first 75 years before Jenner actually adds something to understanding the whole process. Jenner was prepared to listen to the folk wisdom that said that people who'd had cowpox wouldn't get the smallpox. And he actually tried this out in an experiment. So here he is with his publication on his method of preventing smallpox. He's got on the table there's a cow's hoof and things, and you could possibly argue that this man saved more human lives than anybody else in human history so far. That's certainly put forward by some people. So in May 1796, Jenner collected some cowpox pus from Sarah Nelm's hand. I've showed you that earlier. So it was her cowpox pustules that he got, and then he scratched with a boy called James Phipps and rubbed the cowpox into that wound. James Phipps caught cowpox, came out in spots, recovered, everything was fine. 6 weeks later, Jenner did the same thing, but this time he used live smallpox. So he variolated the little boy, and he couldn't make the smallpox take. He wouldn't come out in smallpox spots, and he tried it several times, and then was reassured that the cowpox actually had prevented the child from catching smallpox. These are the lances that he used, and he coined the term vaccination as the word for what he was doing. He actually later developed a system of scratching the patient's skin with a pointed piece of ivory dipped in cowpox pus. To help spread the process of vaccination more widely, he dipped threads in cowpox pus and sent them to various people who were keen to become practitioners of vaccination. This is his house in Berkeley and in Gloucestershire. It was called the Chantry, and he lived there from 1785 to his death in 1823. In the garden, Jenner had this little garden room, which he called his temple of vaccination, and he would vaccinate poor people from the area, never charging them. He wasn't in this at all for the money. And of course, because it was vaccination, it wasn't dangerous. So the poor people could go back to work, go back to their families, and not spread a fatal disease. Another aspect of cowpox was that he then obviously wrote all of this up. And actually the hand I showed you from the milkmaid is one of the illustrations in this in his treatise. And the whole business of cowpox was an absolute gift to cartoonists. So this is by James Gilray in 1802. The rather glum-looking man is Jenner with a giant lancet, with which he's scratching this woman's arms. And all his previous patients are all coming out in cows from various places, or growing horns, or all sorts of things that are happening to them. It seemed like, in some ways, a great joke, but it worked. Now we come to mass vaccination and the anti-vaxxers. It gradually, obviously, became clear that vaccination was the way forward to prevent smallpox, but it needed to be administered on a national scale to be, and internationally too, to be truly effective. This man, George Rose MP, therefore proposed in Parliament in 1808 to set up a national institution in London for promoting vaccination, working with Jenner. And various vaccination acts were passed. The first one in 1840, and that made variolation using live smallpox pus illegal. So after this point, only vaccination with cowpox could be used. And then by 1853, this Vaccination Act starts trying to make the whole thing compulsory, or the vaccination of all babies at a few months old. Now we come to anti-vaxxers. So here you have, on the right, you have the Jenner, with his giant lancet. It wasn't really that size, as you've seen. Behind him is Thomas Dimsdale. Actually, Dimsdale only lived long enough to explore vaccination in the very, very last year of his life. And behind them is George Rose, holding the rose, so you can see who he is. The three men on the other side, also with large lancets, are the inoculators. And some of the first anti-vaxxers were actually, at this period, were actually inoculators who were furious about being put out of business by the new practice of vaccination. And they are saying they're off to inoculate some people and spread smallpox deliberately. And you can see the poor people in the middle with smallpox and dying there. But what we would call anti-vaxxers go back much further than vaccination. So they were at that point anti-inoculators, and they really go right back to the 1720s. This is a sermon with a splendid title, preached in 1722. A sermon against the dangerous and sinful practice of inoculation. And the preacher's argument was that it's God's duty alone to decide who gets ill, who gets died. It's a punishment for their sins. And to interfere with that is to go against God's will. It was described as attacking God's providence. Actually, if you think about that argument, that you wipe out any attempts to do anything medical to assist people under that scheme. But preachers like Massey were scandalized by the idea of inoculation and preventing smallpox. How could they do it? And Massey starts attacking Charles Maitland in print by name. Now, one thing I think that's very fascinating and really shows that these people have no basis in science. Vaccination using cowpox pus, much safer than inoculation and variolation using live smallpox. Vaccination caused even more opposition than inoculation had, because it's mixing something from an animal with human beings, and that was for particularly religious people absolutely anathema to mix humans and animals together in this way. So the man with his back to you on the left, and he's sprouting a pair of horns, is Jenner, and he's feeding babies into the jaws of the monster of vaccination. Yes, I mean, so the safer method actually had the anti-vaxxers much more incensed against them. And this is a sad point to end on, so we'll say a bit more afterwards. But unfortunately, Alfred Russel Wallace, also connected with Hertford, the evolutionary scientist who, you know, we admire, we have his sculpture here. He was one of the anti-vaxxers. It's quite hard to see why, and I think it's to do with the statistics, because vaccination, well, it should have been totally safe, wasn't if the instruments that we used to carry it out were dirty and infected people, or had been used indeed for smallpox previously, and you know, you weren't really vaccinating then. And he was the most respectable person on the anti-vaccine side. Yes, a blot on his reputation, I'm afraid. So returning to the positive contribution made by people connected with Hertford in the eradication of smallpox, we all tend to remember Dimmesdale, but we know far less about Charles Maitland. And I'd like to suggest to you that his work here, 300 years ago this year, was really significant, and that he ought to be better remembered and celebrated. Now, just finally, these are some of the parallels that I've found between the things I've been telling you from the 300 years ago onwards, and today, and our experience of COVID. One is being prepared to learn from abroad. I think, well, various people think we probably didn't learn enough from abroad, certainly at the start of the pandemic. Trialing and testing a new procedure, we all know about that from the various vaccines, trials, all of that. Getting respected influencers on board. I think it's fascinating that the royal family today have been promoting vaccination as they were back in 1721. Compiling statistical data is really important. You know, is this method safer than that method? Well, the only way you can say is to get a large number of results from people who've undergone either inoculation or vaccination and see which gives the better results. And there's been a lot of that in the last 18 months. Coping with unexpected consequences. We've had a number of those to live through during the COVID-19 pandemic. Inequality of access to prevention. I mean, that was particularly true in this country of poor people when it was inoculation. And it's true across the world today with COVID-19. And of course, opposition from anti-vaxxers. They are always with us. They are just a feature of a new medical process like this. So thank you very much for listening. If you want to find out more, I've got a couple of suggestions. One is to look up some of these people in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography online, and you can access that for free using your library card number. But sadly, they didn't include Charles Maitland in the dictionary, and he definitely should appear, I think. And also a television programme to watch, or actually a short series called Extra Life. David Olusoga and an American colleague made these films, and it's subtitled A Short History of Living Longer. And the first episode was about vaccines and vaccination. Now, I haven't had time to tell you the story of how vaccination reached New England, but that's very fascinating, and that's included in that Channel 4, no, BBC 4 programme. So I do recommend that. Thank you very much.